topic that we put out. Amazing. Thank you. I think the topic that we threw out was how difficult it is to create not just the world, but rather something else. And I want to start with a very famous, I'll call it, it's not really a joke, but it's attributed to way too many people. So I won't say it in the name of anyone, but you might have heard it before. They tell the story of an individual who's all idealistic and wants to sit there and change the world. And he goes out there, tries to change the world, and really just finds it too difficult to change the entire world. So he says, okay, forget about the world. Maybe I can go ahead and change my country. And he gets involved, and I want to change the too difficult to change the country. And he says, okay, maybe just my city, maybe okay, my community, maybe just my family. And it's just too hard. So he says, okay, maybe I'll just work on changing myself. And over time, he starts to successfully transform who he is. And through that, he starts to realize that his family starts to change, then his community starts to change, his city, his country, and eventually the world. And then obviously the story or the meaning behind that is a very simple one, that we always start up all the way over there, but the truth is the thing we have in the greatest control is ourselves. And I want to, similar to like we did last week, start with that anecdote, and we're going to make a little bit of a switch on it at the end with a different perspective, perhaps. But in this week's Parsha, it's really interesting if you think about it. This week's Torah portion talks all about the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, this mobile mini temple that's about, I don't know, like 150 feet by 75 feet. And it spends portion after portion, verse after verse, going into every single detail of what it's built with, how it's built, what the furniture inside is like, what's the clothing, what's the drapery. Every single possible detail you can imagine stretches over many different portions. And the first part of the question that has to be asked is like, do we really need to know all this? I mean, this is something like a temporary, it's smaller than a skating rink. I think a skating rink is something like 200 feet by like 100 or even less than that, 80 or something like that. This entire structure is 150 feet by 75. It's going to travel through the desert for a bunch of years and then eventually go into retirement. Yet it spends so much time in detail going into every single facet. And especially as we know, whenever we study like text, every word, every letter is so important, right? It's got to have a purpose or else it's not in there. It's the best editing job ever. There's no extras. So one has to think like, why waste all these details and give so many verses just on this one aspect? And that's sort of part one. And when you compare it to the fact that if you'd say, what's the greatest creation that had to be described, I would possibly say it's the creation of the entire universe and the world, right? The complexity of everything that's over there. And within that context, we have about 30 verses. So think about that, right? The entire creation of the world, right, is summed up in less than 30 verses. Everything about the people, about the lights, about the galaxies, the stars, the moon, people, animals, water, heavens, everything. God's like, yeah, I can wrap that up in about 30 verses for you. And when it comes to this structure, granted, we might not be the best at building or being the actual contractor, right? I'm not so comfortable in Home Depot to figure out how to do things. But at the end of the day, like over 300 verses of instructions compared to 30. You hear the question? If there's any questions, by the way, I should always say feel free to pipe in. I sometimes talk fast and I don't often take stops for breaths as well. So having someone interrupt me is usually good for my health also. But that's the question. How come so much over there by the creation of the world is so little? And by the creation of this little, mini temple that's traveling around, there's so much detail. Now, first caveat is obviously whenever we have detail, each detail is important. That always has to be known, right? It's like a blueprint. For a person who understands blueprints, right? They understand that that one little line or that one little measurement is key and critical to the building of whatever has to happen. So on one level, whenever we have anything in our wisdom, we've got to always say why specifically, why that color, why that height, why that shape, everything has value. But I want to perhaps maybe suggest something a little bit more that's shared by some of our deeper sources, which explains as follows. It says the truth is, if you think about it, creating the world, what is the world? The world is God creating a place for you and I to live. That's what the world is. So the question has to be asked, how difficult is it or was it for God to create a world for humans to live in it? The answer is, well, it's God. It's not difficult. right? It's almost just like clap on, clap off. God says, let there be, and there is. It's that simple. For the world to be created, for you and I to exist in it, is actually not so difficult for the one who created it. However, what does the Mishkan represent? That Mishkan, that what's called tabernacle, which really is representative even of today, what we call the Mikdash Ma'at, our mini temples, which could be either our synagogues or even our own homes. What are those buildings? Those are buildings that humans make for the divine, the spiritual, and our values to live in. Now, which is more difficult to achieve? God to create the physical world for you and I to live in, or for us to create a space in this world for God and godliness, spirituality, values, growth to live in? For God to do it, 30 verses, he probably could have done it in less. Why 30 verses? We'd have to see why each one of those things are mentioned. For you and I to create that in our lives and our space, that requires a much longer process and much more details. And let me give you even an example of where we perhaps see that, right? We ultimately are creators as well, right? The greatest creation that we can create in this world, right, are people. We have the power. It's crazy when you think about that. Humans have the power to create other human beings. That's like God saying, I'm going to create Adam and Eve, and empowers us to create our own Adam and Chavas, if we call our kids that. How hard is that, right? We don't have to go into the biology of it. Please God, everything should work, and please God, people should have challenges, and everything is a miracle when it happens. But the fact that creating human beings happens is relatively, from our perspective, what we have to do, simple. That's creating a space in this world for humans to live. Now we create those humans. How easy or challenging is it within the human beings to create a space for godliness, values, identity to exist? Is it easier to have a child, or is it easier to raise the child, to instill the values in that child? Right? Rav Hirsch has a beautiful idea by the mitzvah of Pru, the first commandment given to the human beings, be fruitful and multiply, as it's often translated in Hebrew. But he says that's actually kind of redundant. Fruitful and multiply, if I'd ask somebody, what does fruitful mean? It means have a lot of fruit. Multiply means have a lot of people. He says, no, no, no. Pru is like fruit, be fruitful, but Ravu is almost like from Rav, to educate, to direct. There's no mitzvah in just having kids and throwing them into the world. It's having children and then raising them. Which one requires a lot more thought, a lot more strategy, a lot more knowledge? And that perhaps is the way it is with every aspect in life, right? We spoke about the building of the temples that might be considered like synagogues, right? What's easier? Is it easier? Listen, fundraising is never easy, but is it easier to build a campaign, to have a building in order to build an edifice that's going to be a synagogue, right? Or is it more easier, or is it more difficult to then infuse that with life and vitality and growth and spirituality? And all of this is to say that when we look at the Torah, what perhaps it's guiding us to saying is, don't worry about the creation of the physical in this world. That, together with God's help, that's easy, right? What's going to be difficult, where God says, now it's up to you, is now how do you bring me into that picture and make me and what the values are that we've been passing down for thousands of years a critical aspect of what it is that you're trying to build? A friend of mine, used to always play off on the term of Oedipus complex. He said Jews often have edifice complex. We love to build buildings. We love to create structures, have campuses, right? The larger the house, the better it is. But he says the truth is, it's not important what it is on the outside. It's what you're creating for it to be like on the inside. And that all is told to us just by the weight that we see given to one creation versus the other creation in this week's Parshios that we have, and in the beginning of where we are. Now, we said we're going to end with what we started with. And obviously, again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pipe in. But we started with, a person wants to change the world. It's too hard, change their country, change their city. So Rav Amital, who's Rosh Yeshiva, who's the head of the yeshiva in the Gush in Or Etzion, he used to say, maybe you can actually turn it the other way around, right? What do people really sometimes do if you think about it? And a person says, you know what? I've really got to try to find a way to change myself, work on myself, create the values within myself. And then, cynically, he would say, a person says, that's too hard. You know what? Why don't I just try to change my family instead, right? And then they're like, ah, forget it. That's too hard. Why don't I just try to change the city? Right? That was country. I'll change. I got it. I'm going to change the world. Right? And the person sits there just talking about world politics and all the big things and how, right? They're just bystanders talking about what's happening in the news, because the reality is they realize the work has to be done. What's harder to do, to create the world, or really to create that space within our own selves? And therefore, the key aspect of what we learn from this entire piece is, how do I structure the things in my life to be able to create that space for the values to be able to grow? And that has, we know, even within our own homes, right? The things that we have and what we focus on and what we bring in, the conversations we have around the table, what we decide to give credence to. It's funny, I remember when we were doing renovations in our home. I'm blessed to have a nice little library behind me. I remember this was many years ago. I was with my barber, who back then was Italian. And Tony told me, he says, listen, Rabbi, he says, when you build your house, you got to make sure to have room for a double garage. You need a space for the cars, for all your tools, for everything. So we were kibitzing a little bit. We were chatting, and I'm like, listen, I'm not so good with tools, but I said, and not that there's anything wrong with the double garage, but I said, I've got limited space. We're not going to committee of adjustments. I want to stay within my envelope, and I'm like, you know what? I'd prefer to have a library with lots of books and places where I can study and learn and have my children come in and we can do homework together. Right? Every decision that we make and what we build is really a value priorities that we're shifting about what's more important or less important, which takes a tremendous amount of thought. But the reality is that we were entrusted with that because he believed that we were capable of doing that. And the reality is that if we're cognizant on each detail, just like when you build the house, you know that if you're off by an inch, the whole thing might shift or might not work. Or if you have a certain piece of furniture that you want to be able to use and the leg is a little wobbly, it's not going to achieve its purpose of holding what you need. So too on the value structure. If we look at it through that lens, every decision that we make within our lives, within our homes, within our community, and we realize that those details are actually building the space for the values to be able to grow. And once we use that lens, the power that we have is so much greater. Very often we think, what can we do? But the true reality is we're given all the tools and the ability to achieve that all. So yes, creating a space, a world is awesome. And I don't know how God did it, but I'm sure if it was God, it wasn't that tough. The question's asked, why does it take him 7 days? Couldn't he have done it in one day? A great question, maybe for another time. But to create our space for him and our values and our identity and our mission and purpose to live, that takes a little bit more thought. So it takes a few more chapters, but the reality is we're capable of achieving it. And on that note, Chevra, just want to wish you guys a Shabbat Shalom. I think we're finishing within our 9:45 time limit, our 15 minutes. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to jump in. We're going to send out a recap of this because there's a lot of people who just look at the recording. You're welcome to share it with others as well. Maybe in that we'll include in there also the link for people who want to sign up in future weeks to be part of the email reminders that are there. And if there's anything we can do to improve, or topics that you want to be able to discuss, please feel free to send it to me. You should have my email by now. And wishing you a Shabbat Shalom. Next week, be in Israel. And then looking forward to sharing some of what I learned over there and continuing with all of you guys. So